Thank you for that. That was lovely. I feel like I'm always sleeping on the week you guys are here. It's very nice to have you here with us. So, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for that lovely blessing. I'm in a state of shock at this point that I can't believe that the 3 years have gone by and it's all happening. It's magical and scary and wonderful and all of those things. So. All right, how many of you like change? You know, like, I'm a little bit when you go, when your favorite TV show suddenly goes off the air, right? We love that, right? Or how about, it's my favorite, when your product that you love at Trader Joe's is suddenly not there. Like you've been buying it for 10 years, and all of a sudden one day it's gone inexplicably. Or how about that wonderful thing we do twice a year where we turn the clocks back an hour or forward an hour? Isn't that fun? You don't enjoy that? No one does. It seems that humans are naturally resistant to change. We seem to be hardwired to want to maintain the status quo. I don't know if this is an evolutionary thing. For our survival, it most likely is. But the truth is that the only thing in life that is more certain than death and taxes is change. So, knowing that this is true, wouldn't it be nice if we could learn to move through changes more easily and with less stress and strife? And even better, what if we could learn to use those times of transition for the full potential of spiritual growth and awareness that they offer? So you heard me, I think, last week mention this book that I came across, and I have it here if people want to take a look afterwards. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to give a talk today about this, and then I'm going to give parts 2 and 3 on the 24th and 31st. So that gives you 2 weeks in between if you'd like to order the book. And it's an awesome book. Has anybody ever seen that book, How to Survive the Loss of a Love? It's like a little book. One of those books that you keep on your shelf, and when something happens, you find yourself pulling it off and looking at it again. This feels to me like it would be that kind of book for you to want to own. Otherwise, I wouldn't suggest that you buy it. It's the kind of thing that I believe you will look at again and again. So, as I mentioned, the truth of our lives is that our lives are constantly in flux. Just when we get comfortable with a job, or a schedule, a car, a friendship, a relationship, boom, it changes, right? So we have big changes, like the death of a loved one or friend, or the loss of a beloved pet, things like illness or injury. And changes are not necessarily bad or good. They can be either, or they're neutral, really. A relationship ending, moving to another city, graduation, a job promotion, or being laid off from a job. And then life transitions, things like midlife, getting older, perhaps loss of independence or mobility, getting married, getting divorced, having children, having an empty nest, all of those things. Those are pretty big ones, right? And then there are also smaller, seemingly more subtle changes, but sometimes those are the ones that really throw us for a loop, right? So, like I mentioned, when your TV show that you've watched every week for years, all of a sudden is over. You can have that feeling of loss, right? Or changes in your job duties, your responsibilities, or a neighbor or friend moving away. A few years ago, my dad moved to Boston. He'd always lived near me my entire life, and that was actually not a small change. That was a pretty large change for me. So sometimes other people's transitions and changes also impact us as well. What about changes in a church service? I know that wouldn't happen here because we are totally like, whoa, man, we just go with the flow. But there are some churches where, like, if you move the podium, whoa. Change a song, or the order of service.
Or the affirmation.
Or the language. Or a change in minister. That can be very traumatic for a church. So basically, anything that constitutes a change can and often does produce feelings of loss, distress, anxiety, sadness, and sometimes even panic or fear. Sometimes spiritual changes are some of the most difficult ones. Most folks came to Unity because they want to make a spiritual change. They want to grow and change the way they think and the way they are in the world. But sometimes we find those very changes that we are welcoming, we find them frightening, and we might find ourselves wanting to revert to old ways, right? That's very common when you're trying to embrace a new way of being. Sometimes you even find yourself like on the edge of a breakthrough and then you back off of it, right? Oh, I'm not ready to go that far yet. So this is totally normal. Why do human beings resist change so much? Well, it's said that the greatest human fear is the fear of the unknown. And changes bring about a situation of something that is unknown for us. We don't know exactly what it's going to be like on the other side of the change. And we often want to go back to our old ways, even if they weren't good ways, because they were familiar and they were comfortable. Another reason we might resist change is because human beings have this incredible need to create meaning. We need our lives and our existence and the things we do to mean something. So what happens is when there is a change or a transition that changes our roles or our identity or the way we exist in the world, that meaning that we have come to make for ourselves gets shaken up. Think of a woman who is highly identified with being a wife, suddenly gets divorced after 30 years. Or a woman who has thrown herself into mothering her children and suddenly all of her children are grown. It's that loss of that identity, that thing that we identify ourselves with, the changing of the roles. It causes us to have to reevaluate what does this mean? What am I here for? What am I doing? And sometimes the very framework that we've sort of constructed to make meaning of our lives gets threatened or even gets completely dismantled. As I mentioned, sometimes one of the hardest changes to go through is the change in spiritual beliefs. Look at what happened this past week with the Methodist Church. They were on the brink of, taking that next step in evolution that most other Protestant denominations have chosen to make. And they were real close, but they backed off. They got scared. They reverted to the old, comfortable ways. This has happened to me in seminary in terms of the anxiety that can be produced around changing your spiritual beliefs. When I went into seminary, I had, 20 years of Unity under my belt. I thought I understood things. I thought I knew what God was and how these things work. And the process of seminary is to dismantle all of that and pick apart everything you thought you knew and hopefully put it back together at some point, right? Which is, I'm kind of in that place now, that it's all sort of beginning to come back together. But that was really uncomfortable. Really, really an uncomfortable place for me to be. I believe it's part of the process, but it's still an uncomfortable change to go through. So in the book, Robert Brummett, who I think I've mentioned was my teacher and was also Vicky's teacher 20 plus years ago at Unity Village. So he's kind of an institution at Unity. He's a really awesome guy. So he talks about the fact that change, or these transitions that we go through, they're a process. Things don't normally happen overnight. There could be a precipitating factor that's sudden, but the transition and our adjustment to it is a process. It takes time. And the problem is, in our fast-paced modern culture, we have lost our patience with process, right? We aren't very tolerant of letting things unfold in their natural process. How many people have said, is it spring yet? Right? We just want it to be spring already. But that's not the way it works. The seasons, like Vicki has said before, the natural world, the weather and the seasons and such, are such a lesson for us about many things, but in this case, about process. The seasons change gradually over time. Unfortunately, our culture often tells us, what does it tell us? Get on with it, get over it. Are you still dealing with that? Are you still grieving that loss? Are you still adjusting to that? It's time to get on with your life. And so what happens is that we often rush through our changes and transitions, and therefore we miss the richness of this time. It's a time that is so ripe with possibility for self-awareness and for growth. And so he advocates bringing more awareness and more mindfulness to the transitions that we go through. So he talks about 3 different phases of a transition. So it begins with the ending, and then the void, and then the last phase is new beginning. And so today I'm going to talk mostly about the first phase, the endings. And then later, at the end of the month, I'm going to talk about the void and new beginnings. So every change involves an ending of some sort, right? Even if it's just your job duties changing, the old way you used to do your job has ended, and the new way is wanting to be birthed. And so when there's an ending, there is loss. Small or big, right? And when there is loss, the natural human response to loss is grief. Grief is that pain that we feel that we often want to avoid, but it is a natural part of going through these transitions. Again, our culture often doesn't support giving us enough time to truly grieve the transitions that we go through, because there's that pressure, that societal pressure to get on with it, get on with your life, get over it. And so what happens is we often don't fully grieve our transitions, and we go collecting this grief from each thing that we didn't grieve. So he says that we're all carrying this sort of unprocessed load of grief around with us. And then sometimes it could be something as simple as going into Trader Joe's and your favorite product is not there, and you get hit with this like barrage of grief that seems totally out of proportion to the thing that happened. But it's because it has triggered all of this unresolved grief that we are carrying about other things. Sometimes it even takes another loss or ending for us to be able to go back and feel the grief of the things that have passed. And so there is grief, and it needs to be processed. We often even have to sort of die to our old way of being so that we can be born anew in a new way of being. So times of great change and great growth are often extremely uncomfortable, painful even, but they are always meaningful. In fact, pain can be a pretty big motivator for growth and change. That's certainly been my experience. Sometimes I have to get in an awful lot of pain about something before I'm willing to accept the transition that is trying to be birthed through me. So Khalil Gibran said, pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. And so it comes down to our willingness to feel that pain. We're not terribly fond of feeling pain. But as I mentioned, if we don't do that work, it collects, and it will get experienced at some point. It will come out. But you won't have a lot of control over when that happens, right? So better for us to grieve the experience at the time. Often these changes are super painful at the time, but how many people have had an experience that was painful, even horrifically painful at the time, but with some distance looking back, you know that it was the best thing that needed to happen, or that could have happened, right? And most of us have had that experience. And so often our pain comes from our resistance to that change, the change that is wanting to occur. And so we need to grieve those losses, the big ones, the small ones, and everything in between. Brummett, the author of the book, says, grieving our loss is a major step in coming home to our true self. So it's about being connected to ourselves. We have to feel those feelings if we want to stay connected to ourselves. Every time we don't feel the feelings that are there, that need to be felt, we disconnect a little bit from self. So Brummett talks about these primary questions that frame our reality and our sense of meaning. Things like, who am I? What is real? What is my life even about, right? What is my life about? And what is my place in the world? And so whether we realize it or not, when we go through changes or transitions, the answers to those questions get shaken up. And that's where a lot of the discomfort comes from. And the change that is happening can change our answers to those questions. And sometimes it's things that we have held dearly, that meaning that we have come to ascribe to our roles and our being and who we are and what we do in this world. That's why those changes are so big and so hard for us. It can often produce a sense of disorientation, that wandering in the wilderness time. And that's what we'll get to in part 2 when we talk about the void. That's that time that we spend in that disorientation, that wandering. So it can really help to know that this is what's happening to us. Because sometimes we're like, why is this hitting me so hard? Why am I struggling with this? So this is what's happening, is those deeper questions are being challenged. Your answers to them are being challenged. So we need to give ourselves time to move through these changes. And the best thing that we can do is to turn at this time to the God of our understanding to help us through these times. Sometimes those times of transition can force us to our knees. Anybody ever been on their knees? And that's sometimes a painful place to be, but it's a place of surrender, right? It's a place of possibility. And it ends up sometimes being the greatest gift. So we need to remember during those times that there is a divine wisdom, a divine order that is guiding us through this time. Perhaps that, and probably that even brought about this transition in the first place. We may feel lost and disoriented, but we need to remember that our higher self, our divine self, that which is connected to God, knows the way. And we can trust that. We can trust that. It may in fact be, as I said, the universe, our higher self, that is pushing us into this change in the first place. So we don't always know at the time why these changes are occurring. Brummett says the ultimate cause is always the one presence and one power we call God, seeking to express through us more perfectly. I love that. That really helps me understand. God is seeking to emerge, that expression of God that we all are. God is always wanting to express more fully through us, more beautifully, more perfectly, more, help me out here, more wondrously, right? That's the nature of God, pushing forth, just like that seedling pushing forth through the soil. It's pushing forth, trying to birth into expression. Like Vicki calls that upward progressive movement of life. And we can trust that. We can trust that that is the process. Emily Cady in Lessons in Truth says, God is always trying to pour more of himself through us into visibility so as to make us grander, larger, fuller, freer individuals. So this is the process that is happening. Does it feel like it would help you to know when you're going through these things that that is what's being birthed? You guys aren't really convincing me. Yes! So it's important for us to trust this power at work in our lives, even when it's painful and confusing. And we rarely understand the reason for things at the time, but we often get that clarity later on. But we can trust it. We can be certain that that change is going to be for our, if we've been called to it, or it's been called to us, it is going to be for our highest good. I mean, if this turns out to be not true, I'm in trouble because I have relied on this. It's not going to turn out to be not true. I have relied on this many times when I've been in the midst of that change that is so frightening and so threatening. Always trusting that my highest good is what is pushing that change into being. The other gift that we can get from these experiences is the possibility of a new understanding of God that's bigger. Remember we talked about, is your God big enough? When we go through these changes, we can get a bigger God. God is so much bigger than anything we can even begin to understand. But these times can grow our God bigger. And also our relationship with God as we learn to rely on that one presence and one power. And we start to trust that those things that we are being called to are going to be for our highest good. And so we end up having a newer, stronger relationship with God that is sort of forged in the fire of these transitions. And in my experience, that has been the greatest gift of all. So you can begin to prepare yourself for our meditation time. Start to get comfortable in your seat, resting your feet flat on the floor if that's comfortable. Your body as you begin to take some slow, deep breaths, breathing in through your nose, breathing deeply, filling up the chest and lungs with air, holding it for just a few seconds, and then slowly releasing. And another deep breath in, hold it for a few seconds, and release slowly. Now letting your breath return to its normal rhythm and just allowing yourself to arrive right here and right now in this sacred space in which we commune with the God of our understanding. Mind starts to wander to distractions and other thoughts, just gently bring it back to your breath. That breath of life that sustains us, that nourishes us. That breath that is always calling us back to this place of center, of self. This place where we are one with God, where we know that oneness. So just breathing in, and each time you exhale, just imagine letting go. Just letting go, releasing. Breathing in that oneness with God, and releasing fear, anxiety. Breathing in that love, that steadfast love of that one presence and one power. Breathing out stress, worry, attachment. in all things. I can turn within and I can trust that guidance. That force of God within me that is always pushing me forward to express more of the divine. More beauty, more love, more freedom, more peace, more joy. I trust that which is being birthed in me today, that which is seeking to be expressed. And I open myself fully to the workings of God in me, as me, and through me. Now I invite you to just rest for a moment in that knowing, in the silence. I just invite you to return to this time and space with a deeper knowing of that place that exists that we can return to at any time, where we know the truth, where we know we are divinely guided in everything that we do. And for this time together, for this knowing, for this community, and for this joyous day, we give thanks. Thank you, God.